In today's video, we're going to be talking about all things Airbnb and VRBO. What's the difference between the two? Is one better than the other? How do you sync your calendars if you're using both to prevent double bookings? I'm going to be going over all of that and way more, so let's just get into it. Airbnb and VRBO are basically the same concept. Guests can book your place as a short-term rental, but they have slightly different features. Luckily, both platforms make it pretty easy for you to be able to sync your calendar, so that way you can prevent double bookings. On VRBO, you simply go to the calendar tab and click import and export. Here you can either import your Airbnb calendar or get the link that you need to export this calendar to Airbnb. On Airbnb, it's very similar. You go to your calendar and select availability. From here, scroll down to the connect calendars section. From here, you can do the exact same thing. You can either import your VRBO calendar or export your Airbnb calendar. In order to prevent double bookings between the two platforms, you'll need to make sure that your Airbnb calendar is exported to your VRBO one and your VRBO calendar is exported to your Airbnb one. Just know that if you do get booked on one platform, it does not immediately show up on the other platform's calendar for at least a few hours. So if you get booked on Airbnb, it's not going to show up that those dates are booked on your VRBO calendar for at least a few hours. In my 2 years of hosting, I've never run into the issue of double booking because of this few hour gap. Next, let's talk about user friendliness, how easy it is for guests and hosts to use each platform. Right off the bat, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think Airbnb takes the cake in this category in like every way. Their platform is just so much easier to use for both the host and the guests. It's easy, it's simple, it's very self-explanatory what every feature does on the website and on the app. It's also very reliable. I've never had any issues with worrying about, is my message getting sent to the guest? Am I getting all of the messages from the guest? However, I have had issues like that with VRBO, and VRBO's platform overall is just a lot more clunky. It feels like it needs a lot of updates that just have never come. I don't find it to be super user-friendly for both the host and guests. It's just not really straightforward or intuitive where things would be. My biggest complaint with VRBO's website and app is the fact that messages seem to disappear kind of frequently, where either guests are messaging me and I'm not getting it, or I'm messaging them and they're not getting it. So I don't know, I just feel like that's pretty not great. Next, let's talk about unique features. Airbnb definitely has some features that VRBO does not. First off, automated messaging. The automated messaging is such a time saver, especially when you're managing more than one property. You can set up these automated messages to be sent whenever a guest books, whenever they're supposed to be checking in or checking out, or even after they've checked out. But in VRBO, you have to manually send these messages. Like if a guest books and you want to say, hey, thanks for booking my place, you have to manually type that out and send it to them. I just find that this kind of increases the risk of you forgetting to message a guest about something, whether it's their check-in instructions or the night before they're supposed to be checking out. I like to send the checkout instructions. These types of things can just be easily missed when it's not automated. Airbnb also has a special offers feature that VRBO does not. So in Airbnb, if you have dates on your calendar that aren't getting booked, you can add a special discount to these dates within the app or within the website. You can easily customize this discount to be any number that you want it to be. If you want it to be 5% off, 10% off, 37% off, it could be any number. This is a great way to attract last minute bookings. VRBO doesn't have a feature like this. There's no way to add a special discount for certain dates. Another feature that Airbnb has that VRBO does not have is smart pricing. So this is a tool that will automatically help you figure out what you should be pricing your Airbnb at. They take into consideration the time of year, supply and demand, what similar listings are charging. VRBO doesn't have anything like this. However, I really don't recommend using the Airbnb smart pricing feature. That's because Airbnb is going to price your listing in a way that makes them the most money and makes the most sense for them, not for you as the host. I find that they often don't charge enough, and it's leaving money on the table for you as the host. I use a pricing software called Price Labs to determine my pricing. This is not sponsored. They have no idea who I am. I just find it's way more accurate than the Airbnb smart pricing, and it earns me a much higher nightly rate. Next, let's talk about damage protection. Airbnb has damage protection built into their pricing, and it's $1 million worth of coverage. It's called air cover. So if a guest damages your property or if they get injured on your property, air cover is going to at least cover some of this, if not all of it, depending on the circumstances. And you work with Airbnb directly to get some of those costs covered. VRBO doesn't necessarily have this. Their damage protection is not included in their booking prices, and it's not included in what you're paying as the host to use the platform. If you want damage protection, you need to have this setting turned on in your calendar, which will add a fee to your guest reservation. They have different tiers of damage protection. It's like $59 for $1,500 of coverage, or $119 for $5,000 worth of coverage. coverage. So it's charging the guests an extra $59 to $119 per booking in order for you to have this damage protection. But also, that's just not a ton of damage coverage. Like, even if you chose the top tier option, $5,000 worth of damages, that's not a ton of money. If a guest really goes bananas in your place, if they ruin your hot tub or break all of your windows or something like that, $5,000 just isn't going to cover a ton. I've also found that ever since I turned this setting on, my VRBO bookings have decreased drastically. And I think it's just because people are so sick and tired of paying for all these extra fees that $59 or $119, whatever option you choose, you're not getting paid that as the host. VRBO is keeping that money. I don't know if it's them or their insurance company, but they keep that money no matter what. It doesn't get refunded back to the guest, even if the guest didn't cause any damages. VRBO does have an option to have a refundable damage deposit that you can set as the host. So you can say, I have a damage deposit of $100 or $500 that if the guest doesn't damage your place, you're going to give that money back to them. But to me, it's like pointless. That's literally nothing in the grand scheme of things. What is $100 to $500 going to do? Now, I personally haven't really had to use damage protection from either platform. I've had to call about questions about it before, but I've never actually needed to get anything covered damage-wise. So I don't know if one is better than the other. I've heard mixed things about both. Regardless of how easy it is to use one or the other, I still really like that Airbnb has it built into their pricing. I just don't understand why VRBO can't build it into their pricing as well. I think that it's really off-putting to guests to have this extra fee, and I definitely think my bookings have decreased because of it. Either way, as a host, you should definitely still have your own personal liability insurance. Just in case something isn't covered by either of their insurance policies, you still have something of your own. Next, let's talk about host support. So when you're calling into Airbnb or VRBO and you have an issue and you need help with something. I've had to call both platforms for a variety of reasons, and honestly, I found that they're equally pretty unhelpful. Next, let's talk about the cost to use. How much it's costing you as the host to use each platform. Airbnb charges hosts a flat service fee of 3%. VRBO, on the other hand, charges hosts a 5% host fee, and they also charge a 3% payment processing fee. So in total, they're charging you 8% as the host, where Airbnb is only charging you 3%. And I still just don't understand, how are they charging you as the host more than double what it costs to use their platform, but they still don't include damage protection? I just don't understand that. Next, let's talk about reviews and how the review system works on each platform. Again, I'm just gonna scratch the surface on these things so you kind of have an idea of what the differences are between them. I could go into so much further detail on each of them though. The biggest benefit of Airbnb is that it lets you review all of your guests, and all of your guests can review you, which I think you might be surprised to hear that that's not how it is on VRBO. You don't have the option to review every single guest, and not every single guest has the option to review you as the host, which frankly, I think is a little bit shady. It's important for you to know that if you're using VRBO, they're automatically gonna list your place on their partner websites like hotels.com and bookings.com. You cannot opt out of this. If you're on VRBO, you're also on hotels.com and bookings.com. You can't just choose like one of the three. It's all or nothing. Any bookings that you get from their partner websites are just gonna show up in your VRBO platform as a normal VRBO booking. You're not gonna be able to tell the difference as a host if this person booked through booking.com, if they booked through VRBO. To you, it's all gonna look the same, like they booked through VRBO. However, any of the guests that book through those partner websites, you can't review any of those guests. You can only review guests that are booking directly through VRBO. So even if you had a terrible guest, you can't warn future hosts about them. And future hosts can't warn you about terrible guests either unless they're booking directly through VRBO, which again, you have no way of knowing if they are or if they aren't. Until, of course, you get to the review stage and you can't review them. So you're not really getting the whole picture on your guest's history if they're potentially looking to book your place on VRBO. I learned this the hard way when I had a bad experience with a guest who didn't follow my house rules, and I wanted their review to reflect that. When I went to leave their review, I just couldn't. It just wouldn't let me. I was so determined to leave these guests a review and be honest about how bad of guests they were that I called VRBO support to be like, why can't I leave this review? And that's when I learned that if they book through booking.com or hotels.com, you can't review them, which I just think is super shady and not cool. Now, that may have changed in the few months it's been since I called about this issue, but it hasn't changed as far as I'm aware of. So which platform is better? I have my places listed on both platforms, which I think is good to do to have not all of your eggs in one basket, but I definitely prefer Airbnb, which I think I probably made a little obvious in this video. I know that some hosts prefer VRBO, but I honestly just don't understand why when you break down the differences between the two. VRBO costs more to use, it has less features, damage protection isn't included, and you can't review every guest. This is also purely anecdotal on my part, but most of the issues I've had with guests have been guests that have booked through VRBO and not guests that have booked through Airbnb. It just seems like I'm having less issues with my Airbnb guests than I am with my VRBO guests. In my opinion, VRBO is just more of a do it at your own risk type platform on the whole. There's obviously benefits to being listed on it and exposing your booking audience to not only VRBO, but also to bookings.com and hotels.com, but it is still a little bit risky for all of the reasons that I mentioned. So it's still worth it to me, but I definitely think it could just be so much better. I'm not saying that Airbnb is perfect. I definitely have some minor issues with them as well, but if we're just comparing apples to oranges, I will say that I prefer Airbnb. That's it for me today. If you enjoyed watching this video, then you might find my last video helpful as well. And if you want to see more of the behind the scenes type stuff, my day-to-day experience as a host, make sure you're following me on YouTube Shorts or on TikTok. Until next time, happy hosting.